Alright, so this article completely caught me off guard. I honestly thought that this wasn't happening anymore, but it sounds like it's not government run, just a bunch of assholes. But anyway, the article is titled Indigenous Women in Canada Forcibly Sterilized Decades After Other Rich Countries Stopped. So, decades after many other rich countries stopped forcibly sterilizing Indigenous women, numerous activists, doctors, politicians, and at least 5 class action lawsuits say the practice has not ended in Canada. A Senate report last year concluded this horrific practice is not confined to the past, but clearly is continuing today. In May, a doctor was penalized for forcibly sterilizing an Indigenous woman in 2019. Uh. Oh. Yay, allergies. Indigenous leaders say the country has yet to fully reckon with its troubled colonial past or put a stop to a decade-long practice that is considered a type of genocide. There are no solid estimates on how many women are still being sterilized against their will or without their knowledge, but Indigenous experts say they regularly hear complaints about it. Senator Yvonne Boyer, whose office is collecting the limited data available, says at least 12,000 women have been affected since the 1970s. Whenever I speak to an Indigenous community, I am swamped with women telling me that forced sterilization happened to them. Boyer, who has Indigenous Métis heritage, told the Associated Press. Medical authorities in Canada's Northwest Territories issued a series of punishments in May in what may be the first time a doctor has been sanctioned for forcibly sterilizing an Indigenous woman, according to documents obtained by the AP. The case involves Dr. Andrew Kotiska, who performed an operation to relieve an Indigenous woman's abdominal pain in November 2019. He had her written consent to remove her right fallopian tube, but the patient, an Inuit woman, had not agreed to the removal of her left tube. Losing both would leave her sterile. Despite objections from other medical staff during the surgery, Kotiska took out both fallopian tubes. The investigation concluded there was no medical justification for the sterilization, and Kotiska was found to have engaged in unprofessional conduct. Kotiska's severe error in surgical judgment was unethical, cost the patient the chance to have more children, and could undermine trust in the medical system, investigators said. The case was likely not exceptional. This is just disgusting. Thousands of Indigenous Canadian women over the past 7 decades were coercively sterilized, in line with eugenics legislation that deemed them inferior. In the U.S., forced sterilizations of Native American women mostly ended in the 1970s. That is still way too recent. I was alive already. After new regulations were adopted requiring informed consent. The Geneva Conventions describe forced sterilization as a type of genocide and crime against humanity, and the Canadian government has condemned reports of forced sterilization elsewhere, including among Uyghur women in China. In 2018, the UN Committee Against Torture told Canada it was concerned about persistent reports of forced sterilization, saying all allegations should be investigated and those found responsible held accountable. In 2019, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau acknowledged that the murders and disappearances of Indigenous women across Canada amounted to genocide, but activists say little has been done to address ingrained prejudices against the Indigenous, allowing forced sterilizations to continue. In a statement, the Canadian government told the AP it was aware of allegations that Indigenous women were forcibly sterilized and the matter is before the courts. Sterilization of women without their informed consent constitutes an assault and is a criminal offense, the government said. We recognize the pressing need to end this practice across Canada, it said, adding that it is working with provincial and territorial authorities, health agencies, and Indigenous groups to eliminate systemic racism in the country's health systems. Boyer, the senator collecting data on the issue, recalled once being approached by a tearful Indigenous woman describing her forced sterilization. It made my knees buckle to hear her story and to realize how common it was, Boyer said. Nothing has changed legally or culturally in Canada to stop this. Indigenous people comprise about 5% of Canada's nearly 40 million people, with the biggest populations residing in the North Nunavut, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. The more than 600 Indigenous communities known as First Nations face significant health challenges compared to other Canadians. Suicide rates among Indigenous youth are 6 times higher than their counterparts, and life expectancy of First Nations peoples is about 14 years less than other Canadians. Well, I can't blame them. I mean, if you're being discriminated against and forcibly sterilized, yeah. Until the 1990s, Indigenous people were mostly treated in racially segregated hospitals where there were reports of rampant abuse. The 90s. Oh my God. I had already graduated high school. It's difficult to say how common sterilization, with or without consent, happens. Canada's National Health Agency doesn't routinely collect sterilization data, including the ethnicity of patients or under what conditions it happens. In 2019, Sylvia Tucano told the Senate committee investigating forced sterilizations about how she gave birth in a Saskatoon hospital in July 2001. She described being disoriented from medication and being tied to a bed as she cried. I could smell something burning, she said. When the doctor was finished, she said, They're tied, cut, and burnt. Nothing will get through that, Tucano said, referring to her singed fallopian tubes. She said she hadn't consented to the procedure. The Senate committee work was prompted by a previous 2016 investigation led by Senator Boyer into about a dozen forced sterilizations of Indigenous women at a Saskatchewan hospital. In November, a report documented nearly 24 forced sterilizations in Quebec from 1980 to 2019. Including one woman who said her doctor told her after bladder surgery that he had removed her uterus at the same time, without her consent. Why? The report concluded that doctors and nurses incessantly questioned whether a First Nations or Inuit mother wants to be sterilized after the birth of her first child seems to be an existing practice in Quebec. What the hell? Some women were not even aware they were sterilized. Morningstar McCready, an Alberta-based Indigenous author, was sterilized as a 14-year-old, but didn't find out until decades later when she sought help after being unable to conceive. I went into a catatonic stage and had a nervous breakdown, McCready wrote in her 2021 book, Sacred Bundles Unborn. She told the AP the cost to First Nations peoples of coerced sterilization was staggering, noting the procedures were previously routine in Indigenous residential schools and hospitals. There are many generations of Indigenous persons denied life as an effective genocide, she said. The Senate report on forced sterilization made 13 recommendations, including compensating victims, measures to address systemic racism in health care, and a formal apology. In response to questions from the AP, the Canadian government said it had taken steps to try to stop forced sterilization, including investigating more than 87 million Canadian dollars, or 65 million American dollars, to improve access to culturally safe health services, one-third of which supports Indigenous midwifery initiatives. Last year, the government allocated 6.2 million Canadian dollars, or 4.7 million American dollars, to help survivors of forced sterilization. It was the Senate report was further evidence of a broader need to eliminate racism and acknowledged that bias in the health system continues to have catastrophic effects on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. I just cannot imagine being so racist as a physician, being so racist against a group of people that you will still forcibly sterilize them. I mean, this isn't about, oh, this is a program and they're just following the rules. No, this is no longer about that. They are just racist fucks. Ugh. Dr. Alika LaFontaine, the first Indigenous president of the Canadian Medical Association, recalls times in his own training when it was unclear whether Indigenous women had agreed to sterilization. In my residency, there were situations where we would do a C-section on patients and someone would lean over and say, "So we'll also clip her tubes," the fallopian tubes. He said, "It never crossed my mind whether these patients had an informed conversation about sterilization," he said, adding he assumed that had happened before patients were on the operating table. Just the fact that that was a part of the conversation, like it was no big deal. Oh yeah, they had a kid, so we're just going to, tie their tubes. I have heard of many young white women, who beg their physicians to have their tubes tied because they don't want to have kids. But the doctors are, oh, you might change your mind and want kids one day, blah, blah, blah. And here these fucks are doing this forcibly to women simply because they're First Nation? One problem, LaFontaine said, is that many First Nations women must fly hundreds of miles south to deliver their babies. That happens because we literally did not build any health facilities where Indigenous people live. Because, what do we care if they live? It's not like they're people or anything. Jerry Sharp, president of, Pakatuit Inuit Women of Canada, I know I butchered that, said health centers serving Inuit women often aren't staffed by Indigenous people, resulting in translation problems. For example, in Inuit culture, people often communicate with facial expressions, like raising their eyebrows for yes or wrinkling their nose for no. Doctors will be speaking, and they look to the women to acknowledge something. When she raises her eyebrows, the doctor labels it as non-responsive, Sharp said. Oh my God. It never occurred to anybody that different cultures are different? What year are we in? What century are we in? Dr. Ewan Affleck, who made a 2021 film, The Unforgotten, about the pervasive racism against Canada's Indigenous people, said the way forced sterilization happens now is more subtle than in the past. He noted an ongoing power imbalance in the country's health system. If you have a white doctor saying to an Indigenous woman you should be sterilized, it may very likely happen, he said. That is so creepy and disgusting. There are at least 5 class action lawsuits against health, provincial, and federal authorities involving forced sterilizations in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec, British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, and elsewhere. May Sarah Cardinal, the representative plaintiff in the Alberta case, said she was pressured into having her tubes tied after having her second child in 1977, but the doctors never explained the procedure was irreversible. Of course not. The doctor told me there are hard times ahead. How are you going to look after a bunch of kids? What if your husband leaves? Cardinal told the AP. I was afraid if I didn't go through with it, they would be angry with me, and I didn't feel like I had a say. Cardinal only realized she had been a victim of forced sterilization when her daughter, Anita, pieced it together after watching a video in a university class about eugenics and forced sterilization. My mother had always told me she wanted more children, but she didn't have a choice, Anita Cardinal said. May Sarah Cardinal said she recalled her doctor asking if she and her husband were Native Canadians, and wondered why that should make a difference. I would see mothers with their kids, and my heart ached not to be able to have more, she said. Just think about this. A man who probably knows nothing about this woman's financial situation, unless maybe she told him, just assumes that you can't have a bunch of kids because you can't afford it. And what are you going to do if your husband leaves? I mean, do these questions ever get asked of white people? No, because there are no stereotypes around like that. No stereotypes around white people like that. It is disgusting. How in the world was this going on still so recently? Anyway, Kataska, the OB-GYN who carried out the surgery that left an Indigenous woman sterile in 2019, was the president of the Northwest Territories Medical Association and held teaching positions at several Canadian universities. Ugh, obviously no background checks. What the hell? Documents show an anesthetist and surgical nurse became alarmed when Kataska said during the surgery to remove the woman's right fallopian tube. Let's see if I can find a reason to take the left tube as well. Oh, wow. So either he's a sadistic fuck or a racist fuck. Either way, he's a fuck. Kataska told investigators he was voicing his thought process out loud that removing both tubes would lessen the woman's pelvic pain, the documents say. And, it's entirely possible that might have been a thing, but when the medical staff around you is saying no because they didn't consent to being sterilized, it's pretty obvious that he just wanted to sterilize her and just use that as an excuse. Describing Kataska's actions as a violation of his ethical obligations, investigators suspended Kataska's medical license for 5 months. Only that? Ordered him to take an ethics course and reimburse the cost of the inquiry. Okay. Take an ethics course? This has nothing to do with him not understanding the ethics. He's just a racist fuck who wanted to sterilize an Inuit woman. I mean, an ethics course is not going to cure him of racism. The Northwest Territories Health Department said it was the first time a non-consensual medical procedure had been referred for investigation. That sentence could be read so many different ways. Was that the first non-consensual medical procedure in the facility? Or was that the first one that got caught? That could be interpreted so many ways. The woman is suing Kataska and hospital authorities for 6 million Canadian dollars, or 4.38 million American dollars. There was no suggestion in the documents that Kataska was motivated by racism. Kataska declined to comment to the AP. There might have not been a suggestion, but I'm gonna say yes. Because seriously, if if that were the reason, if the reason was that taking out both would completely ease her pelvic pain, he probably would have known that before the surgery and suggest, well, if there's a reason to take out your right fallopian tube as well, if I deem that, that both fallopian tubes are the culprit, do you consent to have me remove them? That is all he had to do. But no. So, yeah, I'm going to say it was motivated by racism. The Canadian government would not comment on Kataska's actions, but said forced sterilization is illegal and prosecutable under Canadian criminal law. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the Northwest Territories said there is no criminal investigation into Kataska. Oh boy. Okay. So, all right. The fact that the Canadian government wouldn't comment beyond saying it's illegal. Well, you can't comment on every sick fuck that does horrible shit. So I'm not going to say, oh, there's something wrong with the Canadian government for not talking about it. But that the fact that this isn't even being investigated as a crime, now that is fucked up. People don't want to believe things like this are happening in Canada, but cases like this explain why entire First Nation populations still feel unsafe, said Dr. Unjali Malhotra, medical officer of the First Nations Head Authority in British Columbia. And yeah, I'm one of them. This shocked the hell out of me. I thought Canada was better than the US. What the hell? So, but yeah, I can understand why the First Nation populations look at the medical community with suspicion. And if you go through that, yeah. And it's not like it's in the past. Like, in this country when the COVID vaccines came out, there were a lot of black people who were afraid to go to the doctor because they did not trust the vaccine. And this was stuff that happened years ago. And this is still happening to First Nations people. Granted, black people are more likely to not be taken seriously in this country, don't get me wrong. But this shit is no longer happening. Not that I'm aware of. I'm pretty sure somewhere in the South there's a doctor reading this saying, would not surprise me one fucking bit. Despite Canada's reputation as a progressive society, its continued forced sterilization of Indigenous women puts it alongside countries like India and China, where the practice mostly affects women from ethnic minorities. In Europe, forced sterilizations affected more than 90,000 Roma women in past decades in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Court rulings, apologies from the governments, reparation programs, and modified health policies have mostly stamped out the practice. The last known forced sterilization on the continent was in 2012. That is still too recent. My God. Granted, the rampant racism in against Roma people, which you might also know by the term gypsies, is still alive and well, but ew. In 1976, the U.S. found that forced sterilizations happened in at least 1/3 of the regions where the government provided health services to Native Americans. The U.S. government has never formally apologized or offered compensation. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Indigenous leaders in Canada say an official apology would be a critical step towards rebuilding the country's fractured relationship with First Nations peoples. Only the province of Alberta has apologized and offered some compensations to those affected before 1972. Wait a minute. I heard Alberta is Canada's version of our South. And they're the ones who are actually apologizing to First Nations people. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Mercredi said she continues to endure the repercussions of being sterilized without her knowledge decades ago. Those who subject women to this must be held accountable, she said. No amount of therapy or healing can reconcile the fact that a human right to have children was taken from me. So that's how the article ends, but this is just so disheartening and disgusting. And yeah, it's just horrible. I mean, we still have issues with, like, when Native women go missing in the U.S., there's no outcry. Usually, you'll see on the news if someone goes missing, it's a pretty white girl. You're not going to see a lot of minorities being listed as missing, and certainly not Native. And yes, I live in north central Wisconsin, so that I'm well aware of this. What the hell, people? What are you doing? Why do this? Except for the fact that you want to limit the population of Native peoples because white people are superior or something. It's just so absolutely disgusting, and I cannot believe that, number one, that this is still going on in Canada, and number two, that it has been, not that it's been going on since, like, that it happened maybe in the 70s, 60s, that was still a fucked up time, but 10 years ago? That's just mind-boggling that this is still happening. I just can't get over that this is still happening in Canada. I thought that they had race relations much more figured out than we do here in the U.S. I thought that they, figured out their shit a long time ago. That when Justin Trudeau came up with this idea of having a more balanced cabinet, that it wasn't controversial because, people were cool with that. But apparently not. Oh, wow. That is just so shocking to me. It really is. I'm gonna need a moment. So, with that, I will see you guys in the next video.